The fortress loomed ahead, its dark spires piercing the grey sky like jagged teeth. Rose felt a knot tightening in her chest as they approached, the weight of the Flameheart Crystal pressing against her back like a silent reminder of the mission's stakes. Though the warmth of the crystal still resonated with her, its presence felt heavier now, tainted by the knowledge that the Order would soon claim it. Each step closer to the fortress made the crystal pulse faster, as if sharing her apprehension. Kaelion walked beside her, his usual light-heartedness replaced by a quiet vigilance. He hadn't left her side since they set out, and though she appreciated his support, it only heightened the unease gnawing at her. The ease they'd found in each other during their journey felt fragile now, threatened by the looming shadow of the Order. "You're quiet," he said, breaking the silence. His voice carried an edge of concern she'd grown familiar with. Rose glanced at him, her expression guarded. The walls she'd let down during their journey were slowly rebuilding themselves. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, the crystal warming against her back as if encouraging her to speak. "About what happens next. The magisters aren't going to let me keep the crystal. It's too powerful." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Kaelion nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Something flickered across his face. Doubt? Regret? Before settling into careful neutrality. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean they can take away what it's given you." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the uncertainty swirling in her mind. The crystal had changed her, there was no denying that. But whether it was for better or worse, she wasn't sure. And as they drew closer to the fortress, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one carrying secrets. When they reached the gates of the fortress, 2 sentinels stepped forward, their faces hidden beneath featureless helmets of black metal. Without a word, they motioned for Rose to halt, their presence radiating cold authority. The very air seemed to grow heavier under their emotionless gaze. "Stand aside," she said firmly, her whip coiled at her hip. Even without the crystal, she could feel her power thrumming beneath her skin, ready to be called. One of the sentinels raised a hand pointing to the pack slung over her shoulder. "The artifact," he said, his voice cold and mechanical, devoid of any humanity. Rose's fingers tightened around the strap, the crystal pulsing one last time against her back, as if in protest. But Kaelion placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle yet insistent. "Let them take it," he said softly. "You've done your part." Something in his tone made her glance at him sharply, but his expression revealed nothing. Reluctantly, Rose handed over the pack, watching as the sentinel carried it through the gates and into the fortress. The absence of the crystal's warmth left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. It was as though a piece of herself had been taken with it, leaving behind an emptiness that ached. "Come on," Kaelion said, nudging her forward. His hand lingered on her arm, a small comfort in the growing cold. "The magisters will want their report." The chamber was just as oppressive as before, its dark stone walls lit by flickering braziers that cast dancing shadows across ancient runes. Rose stood in the centre, her shoulders squared despite the tension radiating from the circle of magisters surrounding her. Their hooded faces seemed more mask-like than ever, watching her with calculated intensity. The Grand Magister stepped forward, his gaze sharp as it swept over her, searching for any sign of weakness. "You have returned," he said, his tone devoid of warmth, "and you have succeeded." Rose didn't reply, her jaw clenched as she waited for the inevitable follow-up. She could still feel echoes of the crystal's power beneath her skin, wondering if they could sense it too. "The Flameheart Crystal is now in our possession," he continued, his words deliberate and measured. "And yet, I sense a change in you. Tell me, Rose, what did the crystal reveal?" She hesitated, her mind racing. If she admitted to the power it had granted her, they would see her as a threat. But if she lied, they would know. The magisters always knew. Their eyes seemed to pierce through every defense she'd built. "It showed me control," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath. "It gave me clarity over my magic." A half-truth, safer than a lie, but far from the whole story. The Grand Magister studied her for a long moment before nodding, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Good. Perhaps you are finally becoming what we require of you." The words sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. The phrase, "what we require of you," echoed in her mind like a warning. "You are dismissed," the Grand Magister said, waving a hand as if shooing away an annoying insect. "For now." The two words hung in the air like a threat, and Rose felt their weight as she turned to leave the chamber, every step measured and controlled, despite her desire to run. As they left the chamber, Rose felt Kaelion's presence beside her, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. The cold stone corridors seemed less oppressive with him there, though the echo of the Grand Magister's words still followed them. "They don't deserve you," he said quietly once they were out of earshot. His voice carried an edge of anger she hadn't heard before. Rose glanced at him, her expression conflicted. The torchlight caught the uncertainty in her eyes. "Maybe. But they're the ones who made me." Kaelion stopped, turning to face her. His hand caught her arm gently, forcing her to meet his gaze. "No, Rose. You made yourself. Everything you've done, everything you've become, that's you, not them." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment his words hung in the air, and Rose felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or something even more fragile. The warmth of his touch seemed to chase away the lingering chill of the Magister's chamber. "Come on," she said, her voice softer now. "Let's get out of here." Kaelion fell into step beside her, his hand brushing hers as they walked. The contact was brief but deliberate, carrying promises neither of them dared to voice. And, though the weight of the Order's expectations still pressed heavily on her, she felt a flicker of warmth that refused to be extinguished. A spark that had nothing to do with her fire magic and everything to do with the man walking beside her. The fortress was unnervingly still that evening, its corridors empty save for the occasional whisper of wind through ancient stone. After their mission's success, Rose expected Kaelion to disappear into the background as he often did, but instead, he sought her out. She found him waiting for her in one of the smaller training rooms, a bottle of amber liquid and two mismatched cups sitting on a nearby bench. The space felt different in the evening light, more intimate without the usual clash of weapons and magic. He grinned when she entered, his casual demeanour a welcome contrast to the fortress's oppressive atmosphere. "You're late," he teased, picking up the bottle. His eyes held that familiar glint of mischief. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Rose raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. "And what exactly is this?" "A celebration," he said, pouring the liquid into the cups with practiced ease. "We survived the mission, brought back the crystal, and you showed everyone just how unstoppable you are. If that doesn't deserve a drink, I don't know what does." Rose hesitated, her gaze flicking to the bottle. Even now the Order's rules hung over her like a shadow. "You know the magisters would lose their minds if they found out about this." Kaelion smirked, holding out one of the cups. The amber liquid caught the light like trapped fire. "Then it's a good thing they're not invited." She rolled her eyes but stepped forward, taking the cup from his hand. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a familiar warmth through her that had nothing to do with the drink. "Fine. Just one." They sat on the bench, the silence between them easy and companionable. The drink was strong, burning its way down her throat and leaving a pleasant warmth in its wake. Rose leaned back, letting out a small sigh as the tension in her shoulders eased. For the first time since returning to the fortress, she felt like she could breathe. "Not bad," she admitted, swirling the liquid in her cup. The familiar scent reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. Kaelion chuckled, leaning closer, his shoulder pressed against hers, solid and warm. See? I do know how to take care of you. Rose shot him a sidelong glance, her lips twitching into a faint smile. The nearness of him made her pulse quicken. Don't push your luck. As the night wore on and the bottle grew lighter, the space between them seemed to shrink. Kaelion's teasing softened into quiet admiration, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite herself. The shadows played across his features, making him look younger, more vulnerable. You know, he said, his voice low and intimate in the quiet room. I wasn't joking earlier. You were incredible out there, watching you take control like that. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. Rose looked away, her cheeks warming under his gaze. The drink had loosened something in her chest, making it harder to maintain her usual walls. I was just doing what I had to. No, Kaelion said, leaning in slightly. His warmth radiated against her side, familiar and dangerous all at once. It was more than that. You're more than that, Rose. You're extraordinary. Her breath hitched, the sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his as her defenses faltered. In the dim light, she could see every detail of his face, every emotion he usually kept hidden behind that playful smile. Kaelion. Before she could say anything more, he closed the small distance between them, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was as gentle as it was deliberate. For a moment, Rose froze, her mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. But then she let herself sink into it, her hand finding its way to his cheek as she kissed him back. The warmth that spread through her chest had nothing to do with the drink or her magic. It was something entirely new and terrifyingly wonderful. When they finally pulled apart, Kaelion rested his forehead against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand had found its way to her waist, anchoring her to the moment. I'm here, Rose. Always. Her chest tightened and she nodded, her voice soft. The vulnerability in his words echoed her own. I know. The next morning, Rose woke to find Kaelion already awake, sitting near the small window with the faint light of dawn casting shadows across his face. He looked lost in thought, his usual grin replaced by a pensive expression that made him seem almost like a stranger. Morning, she said, her voice still rough with sleep as she sat up. Kaelion turned to her, his smile reappearing as if on cue, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Morning, Firebrand. Sleep well? Well enough, she replied, stretching. The events of last night lingered in her mind, making her chest warm. You? Didn't sleep much, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. Something in his posture spoke of hidden tension. Too much on my mind. Rose frowned, watching him carefully. The early morning light cast half his face in shadow. About what? Kaelion hesitated for just a fraction of a second before replying, a pause so brief she almost missed it. The magisters. They'll want to test the crystal soon, you know. Probably on someone. The words hit her like a bucket of cold water. What do you mean? On someone? Realizing his mistake, Kaelion quickly shook his head, his grin reappearing with practiced ease. Nothing, just me being paranoid. Forget I said anything. He waved it off with a casualness that felt too rehearsed. Rose stared at him, her instincts prickling. But the easy charm in his smile made her doubt her suspicions, even as something cold settled in her stomach. If you're hiding something, Kaelion. I'm not, he said quickly, standing and moving to her side with fluid grace. I'd never keep anything from you, Rose. You know that. His hand brushed hers, the warmth of his touch melting away the tension in her chest, despite her misgivings. She let out a slow breath, nodding. Okay, I'll let it go. For now. Kaelion smiled, his relief almost imperceptible beneath his usual charm. Good. Now come on. We've got a whole day of avoiding the magisters ahead of us. But as he led her from the room, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, like a shadow passing over the sun. The sunlight, or what passed for it in the umbral realm, filtered weakly through the high windows of the fortress, casting muted beams across the training yard. Rose and Kaelion sat on a low stone wall, sharing a quiet breakfast of simple bread and dried meat. The atmosphere between them felt lighter than usual, a rare reprieve from the fortress's suffocating weight. The memory of last night's kiss lingered between them, unspoken but present in every shared glance. Kaelion leaned back, stretching as he grinned at her. The morning light caught the silver threads in his grey eyes. You know, for someone who's always brooding, you're surprisingly good company when you try. Rose rolled her eyes, though her lips twitched into a faint smile. And here I thought you stuck around because of my charm. The words came easier now, the walls between them softer than before. Well, that too, he teased, his grey eyes glinting with familiar mischief. But don't let it go to your head. They spent the morning like that, trading light-hearted jabs and easy conversation. For once, Rose let herself relax, the tension of the previous days melting away in Kaelion's presence. Each smile they shared felt like a small act of rebellion against the fortress's oppressive atmosphere. But as the sun climbed higher, Kaelion glanced at the sky and sighed, something shifting in his expression. Duty calls, he said, standing and brushing crumbs from his hands with unusual precision. Rose frowned slightly, tilting her head. The sudden change in his demeanour set off a faint warning in her mind. What duty? He gave her a sheepish smile that didn't quite match the calculation in his eyes. The boring kind. Inventory reports, supply checks, all the glamorous things that come with being a servant of the Order. Sounds thrilling, she said dryly, standing as well. She searched his face for any hint of what he wasn't saying. Kaelion stepped closer, his voice softening as he invaded her space. The familiar scent of him made her pulse quicken despite her doubts. I'll catch up with you later, Firebrand. Don't go burning down the library while I'm gone. Rose smirked, her hands resting on her hips. No promises. With a quick wink, Kaelion turned and strode off, leaving Rose alone in the courtyard. She watched him go, unable to shake the feeling that something about his departure felt wrong, like watching a shadow move against the light. The library was one of the few places in the fortress where Rose felt some semblance of peace. Its towering shelves, crammed with ancient tomes and scrolls, offered a quiet refuge from the relentless demands of the magisters. The musty scent of old parchment and leather bindings wrapped around her like a familiar blanket as she wandered the aisles, her fingers trailing along the spines of the books as she searched for anything that might shed light on the crystal's origins. But as she reached for a particularly worn volume, its binding cracked with age, movement outside the library's arched doorway caught her attention. She turned just in time to see Kaelion slipping through a narrow side passage, one that led to the Magister's private chambers. His movements were too deliberate, too careful, nothing like his usual casual grace. Her brows furrowed. Kaelion had never mentioned running errands for the Magisters before, and though she trusted him, or wanted to, the sight of him disappearing into their domain sent a chill down her spine. His earlier words about inventory reports echoed in her mind, ringing hollow now. Curiosity, tinged with unease, pulled her from the library. She moved quickly but silently, her years of training serving her well as she slipped into the corridor and followed his path. Each step felt like a betrayal of the trust they'd built, but something deeper than doubt drove her forward. The passage was dimly lit, the torches casting long, flickering shadows across the cold stone walls. Rose slowed as she neared the Magister's chamber, her heart pounding in her chest. Voices echoed faintly from within, and she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. The stone was cold against her back, a stark reminder of how exposed she was if anyone were to find her here. "She's making progress," Kaelion's voice said, the casual charm stripped away and replaced with a tone that was cold and professional, a voice she had never heard him use before. Rose's breath caught, her body going rigid as she edged closer to the slightly ajar door. The stone beneath her fingers felt like ice. "And the crystal?" one of the magisters asked, their voice low and gravelly. The sound made her skin crawl. "It's amplifying her abilities," Kaelion replied with clinical detachment. "She's stronger than ever, but the emotional volatility is still there. She's unstable, but that instability makes her easier to manipulate. She trusts me, more than she should." The words fell like stones in the quiet corridor. Rose's stomach churned, each word cutting through her like a blade. The warmth of his kiss from the night before turned to ash in her memory. "And her loyalty?" the magister pressed. Kaelion hesitated, then said, "For now, she's loyal. But if she ever suspects the truth—" His voice carried none of the warmth she had come to associate with him. "She won't," the magister interrupted, their tone final. "That is your job, Kaelion. Ensure she remains under control. We cannot risk her power falling outside our grasp." "Yes, Grand Magister," Kaelion said, his voice betraying no emotion. No hint of the man who had held her close and promised to always be there. Rose backed away from the door, her mind racing and her world crumbling. Her hands trembled as the familiar heat of her fire magic threatened to flare, responding to the storm of betrayal raging inside her. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm, though each breath felt like swallowing glass. If she lost control now, they would hear her, and she wasn't ready to confront Kaelion. Not yet. Not when every memory of their time together was being rewritten into a calculated lie. As quietly as she had come, Rose slipped away, her heart hammering in her chest. The warmth she had felt that morning, the trust she had placed in Kaelion, it all felt like ash now, crumbling in her hands. Each step away from the Magister's chamber felt like walking through a nightmare she couldn't wake from. By the time she returned to the library, her mind was a storm of anger, confusion, and betrayal. Kaelion's words echoed in her ears, his cold, calculated tone a stark contrast to the warmth he had shown her. Every gentle touch, every shared laugh, every moment of vulnerability now felt poisoned, tainted by the knowledge that it had all been carefully orchestrated. And yet, she couldn't fully reconcile the man she had kissed with the one who had spoken so dispassionately about controlling her. The memory of his lips on ours, the tenderness in his eyes. Had it all been an act? Part of her wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to see if his mask would crack under the weight of her accusations. But another part, one that burned with a growing fury, wanted to wait, to uncover the full extent of the betrayal before making her move. For now, she would play the role they expected of her, the unstable weapon they thought they could control. But in her heart, the fire had already been lit, and when the time came, it would consume them all. Let them think they had her under their thumb. Let Kaelion believe his manipulation had worked. They would learn too late that they had underestimated her. The fire within her stirred, clawing its way to the surface like a living thing responding to her pain. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought for control. The last thing she could afford was a flare-up that would draw attention, that would prove them right about her instability. Kaelion, the one person she thought might understand her, might see her as more than a weapon, had been lying to her all along. Every kind word, every shared laugh, every gentle touch had been nothing but a calculated act. The memory of his kiss burned like poison now, a mockery of everything she had let herself believe. Her shoulders heaved as the truth settled over her, heavy and suffocating. The urge to storm back into the armory, to confront him and demand answers, to make him look her in the eyes and admit his betrayal, burned through her veins. But even as her anger threatened to consume her, a small voice in the back of her mind held her back. Not yet. First, she needed to understand how deep this betrayal went, and when she did, when she knew everything, then she would show them all exactly what they had created. By the time Rose returned to her quarters, the fire in her veins had dulled to a dangerous simmer. She paced the room, her thoughts racing like sparks in a storm. Confronting Kaelion now would accomplish nothing except revealing her hand. He would deny everything, twist the truth with that silver tongue of his, and the magisters would ensure she had no chance to act against them. No, she needed to be smart about this. She needed proof. Something that would expose not just Kaelion's betrayal, but the magisters' plans as well. The game they had been playing with her would become her weapon against them. Rose sat at her desk, pulling out a piece of parchment. Her hand trembled as she began to sketch out a plan, the charcoal marking deliberate lines across the page. Each stroke felt like drawing a blade against her enemies. 1. Watch Kaelion. Closely. If he thought she still trusted him, he might grow careless. She would use his overconfidence against him, let him think his manipulation was working while she studied his every move. 2. Probe the Magister's intentions. The crystal was the key to everything. Why had they sent her to retrieve it, only to take it away? What were they planning to do with it? The power she had felt from it wasn't meant to be caged. 3. Stay in control. Her fire had always been her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. If she lost control now, she would give them exactly what they wanted, a reason to tighten their leash. She would show them true control, even as she planned their downfall. She stared at the list for a long moment, her jaw tightening. This wasn't just about Kaelion anymore. It wasn't even about the betrayal that still burned in her chest. This was about her freedom, her power, and the life she wanted beyond the Order's grasp. They had tried to make her their weapon. Now they would learn what that truly meant.
All right, you've made it this far. That means either you like what you're seeing, or you're lost. Either way, no harm in sticking around, right? Go on, hit that subscribe button, join the team, and while you're at it, hit like, because, let's be honest, you're already invested. And the bell? That's for you if you don't want to miss any of the action. You wouldn't want me to come find you. See you soon, and remember, once you're in, you're family.